My name is Lavinia Carrington, and the first time I heard my mother laugh in that courtroom, it cut sharper than any bullet I had ever dodged overseas. I sat in full dress blues, the weight of every medal heavy on my chest, and still to them, I was nothing more than a nuisance to be erased. Across the aisle, my parents sat poised, Nathan beside them, with his fingers drumming nervously on polished oak. Their lawyer smirked, as if victory was already inked into the record. "Just a soldier," my mother muttered, her voice sharp enough for the room to hear. Nathan chuckled under his breath, and even the attorney didn't bother to hide her grin. The words landed like stones, familiar in their cruelty. But I did not flinch. Silence had always been their weapon. That day, it became mine. I lifted a plain envelope from my briefcase and set it gently on the bench before the judge. For a moment the courtroom stilled, as if the very air was holding its breath. Judge Blake adjusted her glasses, curiosity flickering in her eyes. But before she could speak, the heavy doors at the back swung open. Boots struck against marble, steady and deliberate. 12 Marines in ceremonial uniform filled the doorway, their movements synchronized as though they had rehearsed this moment all their lives. They lined the back wall, shoulder to shoulder, every gaze fixed forward. Then, in perfect unison, their hands rose in salute toward me. The room froze. The smirk slipped from my parents' faces. The attorney's pen clattered to the table, and Nathan's bravado cracked into stunned silence. I did not smile. I did not move, because this was never about triumph. It was about reminding them who I had become. The truth is, that courtroom was only the latest battlefield. My war with them began long before uniforms and medals, long before deployments and battle scars. It started in the house where I grew up, the house where silence did more damage than fists ever could. I remember sitting at the kitchen table when I was 8, pencil clenched in my hand, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice the test I had scored a perfect 100 on. Nathan ran into the room, his shoes muddy from the yard, and Mother lit up with praise at his messy sketch of a stick-figure soldier. She pinned it to the refrigerator, as if it were the Mona Lisa. My paper stayed face down on the table until it disappeared with the next stack of unpaid bills. That was the first time I understood I wasn't meant to shine. My father, Gregory, was a man who believed the world had failed him. He had wanted to be more, to do more. But somewhere along the line, he decided bitterness was easier than effort. He never struck me. But his silence had weight, the kind that presses down until your spine bends. If I tried to speak of my dreams, he would glance over the top of his newspaper and mutter, "Don't waste your breath." It was my grandfather, Samuel, who broke through that darkness. He was already an old man when I was small, his hands stiff from arthritis, his eyes soft with a weariness that came from surviving war and loss. But he noticed me. When I came home with a scraped knee, he didn't scold me for being careless. He handed me a peppermint and told me scars could be badges. When I whispered, trembling, that I wanted to join the military one day, he didn't laugh. He looked at me the way no one else ever did, like I was capable. One night when I was 15, after another shouting match with my mother over my plans for the ROTC program, I fled to the porch. The wood was cold beneath me, my breath sharp in the autumn air. I thought I had ruined everything simply by wanting something of my own. Then I heard the screen door creak, and Samuel sat beside me, pulling a battered lighter from his pocket, flicking it out of habit. "Don't let small people decide how big you can be," he said. His voice was rough, but his words landed with a weight I'd carry forever. He didn't tell me it would be easy. He didn't promise anyone would cheer. He just reminded me that the story of my life was mine to write. Inside, the voices of my parents carried, sharp and dismissive. Nathan's laughter blended with theirs, cruel in its casualness. I sat with my grandfather in silence, the lighter's flame flickering against the night. In that moment, something shifted. I realized that if I stayed, I would disappear, and I promised myself I never would. I left quietly, the way unwanted things usually do. On the morning of my 17th birthday, I rose before dawn, packed my duffel bag with a few shirts, a pair of boots, and the papers I had already signed at the recruiting office. There was no dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors, just the clink of a spoon against a coffee mug, and the rustle of my father's newspaper. My mother stood at the stove, her robe cinched tight. She didn't turn when I picked up the bag. She only said flatly, "You'll be back. Girls like you always come back." I didn't answer. The bus station smelled of diesel and cold rain. I remember sitting there with my enlistment contract folded inside my jacket, staring out at the cracked parking lot, wondering if freedom was supposed to feel this lonely. A recruiter with kind eyes shook my hand and told me I had made the hardest step already, but I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The Marines did not welcome me as a lost daughter. They broke me. They stripped every piece of softness until I was raw bone and stubborn resolve. I ran until my lungs burned, carried packs that bent my shoulders, heard voices shouting I wasn't enough. But every night when exhaustion blurred the edges of my vision, I remembered Samuel's words, "Don't let small people decide how big you can be," and I pressed on. Months bled into years. I earned my place not because I was the fastest or the strongest, but because I refused to quit. I learned to read the silence in men's faces, to steady my hands when chaos raged, to make decisions that could mean life or death. Slowly, the girl who had slipped out of her parents' house became someone unrecognizable even to herself. But home never stopped haunting me. Each time I came back on leave, I tried. I knocked on the same front door with polished boots and a chest full of hope. My mother opened it once, blinking as if I were an unexpected guest. "Oh," she said. No embrace, no smile. Just 2 letters and a closed expression. My father barely looked up from the television. Nathan laughed from the living room with his friends. Not pausing to greet me, I stayed 2 days that time, no more. The silence was worse than combat. When I boarded the bus back to base, no one came to see me off. Snowflakes caught on my collar, and I told myself it was better this way. At least the Marines, brutal as they were, had rules. At least their silence meant discipline, not contempt. By the time I pinned on officers' bars, I had stopped hoping my family would notice. I thought I had outrun them, left their judgment behind in that narrow little house. I was wrong, because years later, their greed would drag me back. 15 years passed before I set foot in my hometown again. I had sworn I would never return, not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even for goodbyes. But death has a way of dragging you back to places you thought you had escaped. The call came from a lawyer I didn't know. His voice was dry, practiced, stripped of warmth. "Samuel Whitmore has passed," he said. "The service will be held Saturday." That was it. No message from my parents. No word from Nathan. Just silence. Familiar, merciless silence. I drove through the night, 12 hours without stopping. When I pulled into town, nothing had changed. The sidewalks were still cracked. The storefronts faded. The only thing different was me, the woman in dress blues stepping out of a black sedan. As I approached the church, eyes turned. Some widened, some narrowed. My mother was the first to notice. She swept her gaze over me slowly, from the gleam of my shoes to the medals pinned to my chest. She didn't smile. She didn't move. My father folded his arms across his chest, his mouth pressed into that thin line of disapproval I remembered too well. Nathan looked up from his phone long enough to smirk, then leaned over to whisper something to his wife. They laughed together, right there on the church steps. Inside, there was no place for me. Every pew was filled. The family pew in the front, where I should have sat, was crowded with cousins and neighbors, none of whom shifted to make room. I stood at the back, rigid, my hands at my sides as they carried my grandfather's casket down the aisle. My uniform felt heavier than armor. When the pastor spoke, he mentioned Samuel's legacy, his love for family, his kindness. But there was no mention of me. My name was erased from the obituary, from the acknowledgments, from the very story of the man who had been my only source of love in that house. The ache in my chest was sharp, like shrapnel still lodged under the skin. After the service, people clustered around my parents and Nathan, murmuring condolences. No one approached me. I walked alone to the casket, laid my hand on the polished wood, and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else would." As I turned to leave, I caught a fragment of conversation behind me. A cousin I barely remembered was speaking. "Of course Gregory and Margaret are inheriting everything. That's how it should be." Lavinia was never really part of this family. The words clung to me as I stepped into the cold air. They laughed inside the church. I walked back to my car. That night, in the motel room with its humming air conditioner and peeling wallpaper, I couldn't sleep. The silence felt heavier than combat. Something was wrong. My grandfather was meticulous. He wouldn't have left me out. And deep down, I knew I was being erased on purpose. I woke before dawn the next morning, with the same knot in my stomach I used to feel before a mission. Something didn't add up. Samuel had been deliberate, almost stubborn, about order. He balanced his checkbook down to the penny, labeled every box in the attic, and kept his will in a fireproof safe. The idea that he had changed everything at the last minute, it reeked of someone else's hand. I drove to the county records office, a squat brick building with buzzing fluorescent lights. Years in military intelligence had taught me how to sift through paper trails, and it didn't take long to find the file. The so-called final will was dated just 3 weeks before Samuel's death. Too recent, too convenient. My pulse quickened as I studied the signature. It was stiff, mechanical, like someone tracing a memory. I'd seen his real handwriting in birthday cards and old letters. This wasn't it. The lawyer listed on the document, Anthony Carver, didn't exist. No bar number, no office, just a name typed neatly, as if that alone could conjure legitimacy. I leaned back in the hard wooden chair, heart steady in the way it only became when suspicion turned to certainty. They had forged it. My family, the same people who couldn't bear to make space for me at the funeral, had carved me out of Samuel's life on paper. I dug deeper, pulling property transfers, financial records. Nathan's name appeared everywhere. Bank loans, lawsuits, unpaid debts. And there, in black ink, a transfer request for Samuel's house, filed the day after the funeral. My grandfather's home, already slipping into Nathan's hands before the earth had even settled over the grave. I stared at the printouts until the words blurred. Rage threatened to rise, but I pushed it down. Combat had taught me control. Emotion loses battles, strategy wins them. They thought I was too far away, too busy, too broken to notice. They had no idea I was just getting started. I didn't storm into their house, didn't shout accusations across the dinner table. That would have been too easy for them. Too easy to dismiss me as unstable, emotional, exactly the picture they wanted to paint in court. No, I did what I had been trained to do. I treated it like an operation. The first step was finding someone I could trust. That led me back to General Rachel Hayes. She had been my commanding officer years ago. The kind of leader who remembered names and listened before she spoke. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 5 years, but when I sent a message explaining what I suspected, her reply came within 20 minutes. Carrington, my office, tomorrow. When I walked into her office, she studied me with those sharp eyes that had once seen straight through my fear on a battlefield. I laid out everything, the forged will, the false lawyer, Nathan's debts, the property transfer filed before the funeral dirt had settled. My throat went dry as I unfolded the last piece, the letter I had found hidden inside one of Samuel's old books, the one where he wrote, in his uneven hand, that everything should go to me. General Hayes leaned back, her jaw tight. They've underestimated you, she said. That's their first mistake. We'll map this like a campaign. Evidence, timing, precision. No emotions, only facts. For the first time since the funeral, my breathing steadied. I wasn't just a discarded daughter anymore. I was a soldier with a mission, and I was ready to fight. The morning of the hearing, I stood before the mirror, fastening the last silver button on my dress blues. My hands moved with muscle memory, but my chest felt tight. This was not a battlefield of sand and smoke. This was colder, sharper, a place where lies could wound as deeply as bullets. When I entered the courtroom, my family was already there. My mother wore her best pearls. Her lips curved into a brittle smile. My father's jaw was set, arms crossed like a man preparing for war. Nathan tapped his fingers against the table, a nervous habit he hadn't lost since childhood. Their lawyer, Ms. Porter, rifled through papers with the smug air of someone who thought the verdict was already hers. They began with mockery. Words like abandonment, betrayal, Failure floated through the room, aimed squarely at me. My deployments were painted as evidence of selfishness. My absence at birthdays and holidays was twisted into proof that I didn't deserve anything of Samuel's legacy. At one point, my mother leaned toward the microphone, voice dripping with disdain. She always hid in that uniform to feel important. Laughter rippled quietly from Nathan. I sat still. Years in the Marines had taught me the power of stillness. Let them speak. Let them overreach. When my turn came, I rose slowly, the sound of my boots echoing across the floor. "My name is Lavinia Carrington," I said. "I have served this country for over 2 decades. I'm not here to defend that. I'm here to present the truth." And then I laid it out, fact by fact, document by document, not anger, not tears, just the quiet thunder of evidence. The room shifted. They didn't know it yet, but the tide was turning. The silence that followed my testimony was so complete, I could hear the tick of the courtroom. "Clock!" Franklin, my attorney, stepped forward and submitted the 2 pieces of evidence that mattered most. Samuel's original, will, and the letter he had written in his unsteady hand, tucked away in a book only I would find. Judge Miriam Blake adjusted her glasses, eyes moving over the familiar signature. The room seemed to contract as she read the letter in full. Her expression softened, then hardened again with something almost reverent. She rose slowly to her feet, not out of duty, but out of respect. "You served," she said, her voice low but steady. I nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Marine Corps. 23 years?" Her gaze held mine, and then she turned to the gallery. "Out of respect, I ask all service members present to rise." Boots scraped against the floor. A dozen Marines stood in the back, straight as pillars, their salutes sharp and unwavering. For a moment, the air itself seemed to hum. My mother's face drained of color. My father sagged against the table, and Nathan's bravado shattered into a hollow stare. No one dared laugh now. No one dared move. The gavel came down hard. "This court recognizes the validity of the original will. The estate belongs to Ms. Carrington. Further evidence of fraud will be referred for criminal review." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply breathed, steady for the first time in years. In the weeks that followed, the headlines told the story for me. Whitmore family exposed. Fraudulent will overturned. The same people who had erased me now lived under the weight of shame they had crafted themselves. Invitations stopped arriving. Doors closed in their faces. Nathan lost what little he had left. I returned to Samuel's house, peeling paint and creaking floors waiting for care. Room by room, I repaired it, sanding banisters, painting walls, making it whole again. With his savings and the inheritance, I founded the Carrington Scholarship for children of military families who felt invisible the way I once did. The first award letter bore his name, for those who serve, for those who stand. One autumn afternoon, as leaves scattered across the porch, my mother appeared at the steps. She looked smaller, thinner, her voice trembling as she said, "I don't expect forgiveness." I gave a single nod. She left without another word. Some wounds remained too deep for bridges, and that was enough. Years later, I stood at Samuel's grave with a white rose in hand. "They tried, Grandpa," I whispered. "But they couldn't take who I am." The wind stirred through the grass, and in that stillness, I felt it at last. Not revenge, not triumph, but peace. Because freedom isn't only won on battlefields. Sometimes it's won in silence, by refusing to be erased,